Kyle, congratulations on your Community History Award for your wonderful book, Our Colored Past. And what an achievement. I think there are almost 350 different photographs, all color, obviously, from your archives. But maybe before we go through some of these pictures that we'd like to show people, what was the inspiration for this?
So the inspiration for the actual book is a series of slideshow lectures. Our lectures tend to be pretty popular with our patrons and our local community. We travel them up and down the lakes and visit the different community halls, and then we have our own little mini theater inside our building. But the most popular show by far was one that was called Our Colored Past. And it actually came, oddly enough, from me finding an old laptop of my predecessor, the late Milton Parent, just kind of shoved behind a file cabinet in my office. And on it, he just had the only thing that was on the computer, the one thing, was just a little 30-slide PowerPoint presentation that I guess he had was going to put together for a Christmas show, for one of our Christmas banquets. And I said, Our Colored Past. Well, that's a clever little title. We could probably do something with this. And so what I did was blow it up into a 90-minute presentation, and we just put on a little show for the public. We wound up selling out the first 4 showings of it, and it wound up spawning 2 sequels. And in the couple of years since that slideshow was originally 2014, a few years passed, and there's still a lot of demand with it. But we've had so many thousands of photos come in since then that I thought, okay, enough with the slideshow things. There are other themes that we can move on to our lectures. But this would make a really good souvenir-style coffee table book. That's all I was thinking. This wasn't supposed to be a historical document of any import, necessarily. A nice, fun coffee table fundraiser for our historical society. But once you start actually, just trying to tell the story of each photo could be a miniature book in itself.
Yes, a little research involved for each of those photographs. And it's great to hear that people are so into seeing their local history displayed, whether it's through slideshows or through a book like this. And Our Colored Past, I take it, can have many different meanings in the Arrow Lakes area, right?
Absolutely. Not only is it just a cheeky pun on the idea of displaying the color photos and showing people that, hey, recent history is historical. It is important. What happened in your lifetime does matter. History isn't just black and white in the past. It's ongoing.
But well, let's go through some of the images. Sorry to rush you along, but we want to share about 15 images from the 300 plus that are in the book. And let's begin right on Nacuff's Main Street. And I think this is from 1940. But what intrigues you about this picture to start the book with it?
First of all, it's one of the oldest color photos that you will ever find of Nacuff. It's certainly the oldest color photo that you will find of Broadway Street, which is the main street going through the village. There are a couple of older silent color movie clips from the late 30s, but this is the first actual still image, and the clarity of it is amazing for being 80 years old. And it does take you back to a time before pavement, before development. It has a very Old West feel. If you got rid of the automobiles in the background, and desaturated the photo, this could be any frontier town of the 1890s, with the false fronted buildings. It also tells you that you're in the middle of World War II, the Carry On Canada it's a very different time.
The British flag flying
Yeah,
off the front
yeah.
of
There's
that
no
building.
maple leaf yet, right?
No.
Everything's red, white, and blue, Britain. And so that contrast, the vibrancy of the flags and the displays with the dust of the main street, it's just it's a very frontier feeling. It's a very different.
Yes. Yes. It says community too, with people doing this. And they continue to do this in so many different BC communities. Let's move forward now. And for people who haven't visited the Arrow Lakes area, I thought we'd show this because it just gives you a sense of the stunning landscape that you have around you. But this building in the foreground, it's very important. What's its story?
So this was built in 1910 as the Cuzco Public School to replace the older, smaller school that was just next door. And it served as the local elementary school until 1956. And this photo is 1940. Those maples in the front are about 3 years old in this photo. They were planted for King George VI coronation. And today those maples are 100 feet tall and towering over the street. But that building now is where our public library, our museum, and where I work in the Historical Society archives are all located now. And it's now called the Centennial Building.
It's a wonderful facility. It's chock-a-block full. We were there for the BC Historical Federation conference a couple of years ago, and it's beautifully used. I love it.
Yeah, this view is actually the same view roughly that where I'm sitting right now, looking out from my deck. It's about 6 blocks up the street. That's Saddle Mountain in the background. You can tell it's summer because there's no snow on it. Right now, it's very much covered in snow. But it just goes to show you how much Cusco is influenced by its mountainous landscape. Even though we are inland, we're cut off in 2 directions by a lake. There are 3 highways out of town, and 2 of them require ferries.
Yes, and once upon a time, being on the water on one of these boats was the only way to get around. What vessels are we looking at next?
So the large vessel in the center is the SS Bonington, which operated on the lake from 1911 to 1931. And at this point, at the time of this photo that you're looking at, had been derelict on the waterfront for about 9 years. In 1944, it was actually purchased and had completely stripped, basically just converted into a giant barge so it could serve as a ferry up in the Beaton area at the north end of the lake. And what a pretty ignominious end for such a grand vessel. It's now sitting at the bottom of Upper Arrow Lake in the Beaton Arm, just its hull. The little one next to it, even though it's not actually that little, it's just the Bonington was just that big. That's the SS Minto, which served the lake from 1898 all the way until 1954.
Wow.
It's the sister ship of the SS Moye, which is, if you've ever been to Cuzco, you may be familiar with the SS Moye National Historic Site. They preserved their stern wheeler. We just did not have the money to do so. And we'll talk about the Minto later in the interview.
Yes, we have more photos to show of its demise. Let's move to our next image, which is really compelling. It's a stump, but these names are the names of people who were in a nearby Japanese internment camp, Japanese-Canadian internment camp. What's the story of this?
So this was discovered actually by one of our vice presidents at the Historical Society, whose day job way back in the day was working for the local logging company. And this, you saw Saddle Mountain in the back of the photo of the schoolhouse. Just north of Saddle Mountain is Low Pass, which separates Saddle Mountain from Mount Simons. And it was in that area that while timber cruising, he came across this woodcut in the side of a tree. And you can just read that it was carved in July 28th, 1945. These were men from the Japanese-Canadian internment camp at Lemon Creek near Slocan Lake, who, like many of their compatriots, fellow internees, were often hired out as cheap labor by companies in the area. In this case, these men had been hired out as firefighters to battle forest fires on the west side of Upper Arrow Lake. And during one of these forest fire sessions, I suppose you would call it, they decided to carve their surnames in the side of this tree. And it sat there in the woods for 50 years until Ken Williams, who's now our vice president, found it. He alerted the logging company to it. It sat there for a couple years, but it was eventually cut down. The woodcut was cut out of the tree and taken and preserved, and it now stands on display at the Nikkei Internment Memorial Center in New Denver.
Just to the south of you, and that, what an impressive experience to go there and see this and how life is recreated at that internment camp. It's an amazing image. Mm-hmm. We're going to move to another aspect of the Arrow Lakes and the Cusp region that I think many people have heard about, but maybe haven't actually seen, and that's the hot springs that are around you. And there have been various enterprises over the years, but what's the story of this particular hot spring we're looking at right now?
So believe it or not, for those of you who have been to the much more modern facility, this is the Cuzco Hot Springs as it stood around 1940 or 1941. Just a humble set of cabins. Believe it or not, that big roundhouse in the middle, that's not the pool house. That's just the picnic shelter. The pool was actually contained inside the building behind it. And so it was actually a small indoor pool that could only fit a handful of people at a time. And this is located about 13 kilometers up the Cuzco Creek Valley from the village of the Cusp. And there was not a road built there until 1971. You had to hike up this long trail up the back of Cuzco Creek to get there. It was so remote that it even had its own sawmill on site so that lumber didn't have to be hauled in from town. So just very, very humble, rustic backcountry experience, but all the more worth it once you could get into the springs, of course.
Yes, and there's a whole other book about the hot springs history, isn't there? Because there were a couple of other grand enterprises that didn't really flourish. And there's a trail that connects to the hot springs that you can walk. It's fantastic. We did that a couple of summers ago as well. We keep coming back to the Moai because it was, the Minto, because it was so important to the Arrow Lakes history. This is the last run, this photograph.
Yes, this photo would have been April 23rd, 1954 at Arrowhead, which is one of the 24 or so communities that were lost when the Arrow Lakes were flooded from the Arrowside Dam. Arrowhead was the head of navigation on the Arrow Lakes, hence its name. It was here that the stern wheelers, in this case the Minto, would meet the Canadian Pacific Railway, and then from there freight and passengers would head north to Revelstoke. This seems like a very celebratory photo. All the flags and the people on the deck taking photos and commemorating the event. You see the big wreath on the bow of the boat, but it's actually a very solemn day.
Their hearts are breaking, aren't they, over this?
Yeah. To this day, people lament the loss of the Minto, and that's 66 years ago.
And when I was looking at this earlier, Kyle, I was drawn to the upper left area of the photograph. And I saw this, what got my attention was somebody was standing outside the rail taking a photograph of, is that the captain that this person is taking a photograph
So
of?
yeah, you can see he's taking a picture of the captain and then a couple of the crew members, it looks like.
Who's taking
Yeah,
the picture, do you think?
I have no idea. There were so many hundreds of people in and around the Minto on those 2 days, because it took 2 days to do the full run of the lakes. Just entire villages coming out to greet the boat, that it's impossible to say. I can tell you that the woman in the red hat is actually the wife of the photographer. So that would be Mrs. Beth Maxfield, who wound up being a village councilor in the Cusp. Her husband, Dr. Fred Maxfield, was the longtime physician in the region from 1946 until 1974. And he was actually contracted by the Canadian Pacific Railway to be the on-call physician for all CPR trains and sternwheelers.
It's wonderful to have this record that he took, and others as well. We'll talk about some of the photographers in a moment, but certainly the important story that now begins to emerge is the flooding that you alluded to, the lost communities and buildings and farms. This is, I believe, the Spicer Farm.
Yes.
And why is this an important image?
So one of the myths that was sort of pushed by the provincial government of the time in order to promote the development, the hydroelectric development of the valley, is that the land was beachy and not suitable for agriculture. When we think of agriculture in BC, we think of the Fraser Valley, we think of the Okanagan, but I don't think people grasp just how much agricultural land was lost with the Arrow Lakes. Entire villages dependent upon fruit farming and agriculture. And even right in the cusp, this is the eastern side of the village. There was a huge farm that was originally developed by a Chinese-Canadian man named Sam Henry. It went through the Boisneau brothers, and in 1948, the Spicer family took it over. And the Spicer family, Chris Spicer was an Englishman who was very educated I think he was educated at Y in England, and he thought that he traveled the entire length of the country from Newfoundland to British Columbia looking for the perfect section of topsoil. And this farm actually had an underground spring that made it essentially the most productive truck farm per acre in all of Canada.
Wow, it definitely looks like what we would call Class A farmland now. And how much of this was lost?
About 7/8 of this particular farm was lost. About 2/3 of the arable land in the valley was lost. And the hilarious thing is that our dam was not intended for hydroelectric development. It was intended for flood control, so that in the United States, the dams further downstream, such as the Grand Coulee and the John Day and all the other dams along the Columbia River, could more efficiently regulate their hydroelectric production. And oddly enough, so that the southeastern portion of Washington could be properly irrigated for agriculture. Now, when you go to the store here, you're buying watermelons and tomatoes and potatoes and grown in Washington that used to be grown here.
Yes, so the story of the Columbia River Treaty is endless, isn't it, in that sense?
And it would not be surprising for most of you watching this to learn that the Spicer family were one of the most prominent opponents of the Columbia River Treaty and development on the lake.
Yes, they fought it for years. I think we're
Yes.
going to show a sequence of images now
Yeah.
that gives people more of a sense of the before and after.
Mhm.
This Narrows is obviously before the reservoir was created. Where is that, and why did you include this?
So this is at Burton, which is a little town which formerly was located in between Upper Arrow Lake and Lower Arrow Lake. There were two separate lakes before the dam, and they were separated by about 25 kilometers of what is actually legally known as simply the Narrows of the Columbia River. Burton was at the narrowest point of the Narrows, and you can see how long the wharf in the middle of the image is, because that's how much water fluctuation took place from season to season. You can see that the wharf house is actually in the middle of the wharf. That's how high the water would come up in summer and spring. Whereas in winter, and it barely flowed to a trickle. You can imagine how difficult it was for the stern wheelers to get through that, but they did, thanks to a prodigious amount of dredging. Burton was one of the 3 villages that was actually rebuilt by BC Hydro after the flooding. They were obligated to rebuild villages where there were enough people that wanted to stay. And so Burton, along with Fauquier and Edgewood, were reconstructed on higher ground. But this gives you an idea of what it looked like before. Today, you would just look at that and see lake.
Yes. Let's go to Edgewood next in this next photograph. Some buildings were moved to higher ground, I believe churches and community halls. Yeah. Some weren't. What happened to the Edgewood General Store and Post Office?
Like about 90% of buildings that fell within the line of expropriation, 1,350 feet above sea level, it was demolished. Some were bulldozed. Most were just burnt, simply because it was quicker. This is one of my favorite photos in the book. Again, if you got rid of that pickup truck in the front, you'd be hard pressed to think that this was 1966. This is a backwood. It could be any store in the southern United States with somebody, playing on the stoop with a banjo. Yeah,
exactly.
Just the old advertisements on the front, hand painted. It really takes you back to a time and a place. And,
it just oozes so much history and character. Yes. And you want to go there, but it's gone.
Yeah.
And this next photograph, these 3 women look like they have photos in front of them and they're taking notes. What's happening here?
So these are 3 women in the village of Renata, which is about 35 kilometers northwest of Castlegar. The most agricultural of all of the villages on the Arrow Lakes. And Renata, being built on a river delta, on an alluvial fan, was going to be completely subsumed under the expanded waters of Lower Arrow Lake. And so this is 3 of the longtime residents of Renata getting together to write a book documenting Renata, because they knew that the end was coming for the village. They wanted to make sure that they commemorated it properly. And,
it's quite poignant, isn't it? And it's the beginning of the documentation too, I guess, of the community's story.
Absolutely.
There's another photo that's coming here that may shock some. There's a woman sitting in a chair in front of a burning building. Who is she and what's happening here?
So that is Rose Roan, who is one of the women that you saw in the previous photo, who co-wrote the story of Renata, which was published in 1966. This is 1967, and this is her seated in front of her own house as it was burning, as they're leveling the town site.
She's smiling.
She's smiling. There's a bit of morbid humor.
Yeah.
When you know it's coming, and you know it's been coming for a couple of years, and there's nothing you can do about it. Her son, Bruce Rohn, who is another one of our directors, actually, at the Arrow Lakes Historical Society, not only did he take this photo, he was the one that actually lit the fire. He was a teenager at the time, and he was not going, if anybody was going to burn their house down, it wasn't going to be an outsider. So he took it into his own hands, actually went into his own bedroom and lit the match that took his house down. And if you see the other photos in his collection, it's a beautiful house. It's a beautiful property right in the lakefront. You've got 2 acres of farmland in the back, flowers everywhere. A gorgeous village, largely Mennonite, actually, Renata, which is rare for the interior of British Columbia. But all gone, all under the water now.
I remember you showing this photo at a slideshow when we were in the cusp, and I'll never forget it. It's just, it's so powerful. And the reason is the next picture. This is downstream,
yeah.
And the Hugh Keenleyside Dam eventually named that, I guess, but this is the creation of the reservoir?
Yeah. So, as I alluded to before, prior to the dam, it was 2 separate lakes that are widenings of the Columbia River. The reservoir is a more recent creation. It basically merged the 2 lakes into one and raised the level of the 2 lakes about 40 meters or so. The Keenleyside Dam, as the Arrow Dam, it was originally called, eventually was named on its opening after the president of BC Hydro. It is intended for flood control to help regulate water levels downstream and to create storage for hydroelectric generation downstream. There are some turbines that have been more recently installed on the Keenleyside Dam, but the irony of creating flood control by flooding out 2,100 residents is not lost on the people of the Arrow Lakes, and still a very contentious subject here.
Yes. There have been documentaries and books written to that effect, haven't there?
Yes.
Now we're back to fire and back to the Minto for one last look. What's happening here?
This is the interior of the SS Minto after it has been lit on fire. It's a long time after the Minto was taken out of service. It was donated by the CPR to the Chamber of Commerce of the Cusp, who didn't have the funds to do anything feasible with it. They could only raise something like $930, which is obviously insufficient to...
A little short for the restoration.
Yeah, restore boat.
Yeah.
So it wound up being sold for scrap. The entire ship was stripped. A pioneer farmer up at Galena Bay, which some of you may know is the location where the ferry crosses Upper Lake, named John Nelson, he found out about the auction about a week too late. By the time he made it to the Cusp, everything useful off the boat had been stripped, but he was able himself to purchase what was left of the boat for $850. He towed it up to his farm at Galena Bay. It sat there for 12 years, and he was already an elderly man by the time he purchased it. And when he finally passed away in his 80s, his son, who was also a farmer, he did not have the $100,000 that was deemed necessary to restore the ship. And that's 1968 money, of course, so it'd be far higher today. So BC Hydro said, we can get rid of it for you. And so they were worried that they couldn't actually tow it out onto the lake. It was so rotten by that point, but they actually managed to do it. And rather than, they couldn't do anything with the wood, so they decided to give it a Viking funeral, where you set the ship on fire and send it out to sea.
Very
and so
dramatic.
they did that, yeah, in the middle of Galena Bay, and the hull of the ship sits somewhere buried in the silt. To this day, I believe the Underwater Archaeological History Society of BC is planning a dive there sometime in the next year or two to see if they can actually properly locate the hull. But it'd be buried under a lot of silt. But
yes, there must have been a lot of tears that day. I'm sure
yeah,
it was quite a spectacle.
Only,
but
yeah, that was the only method of transportation up and down the lake until they finally completed Highway 23 between Revelstoke and Nakusp in 1968.
Well, just back to the creation of the reservoir, we have two images back to back here next that give people watching a sense of the before and after, and this is Nakusp again, and it's been cleared, hasn't it, and prepared for what comes next?
Yes. So this is April 1970. This is after one season's worth of the water having come up for the first time to the new level and then gone back down as they withdraw water during the winter. So you can see the old highway bed in the middle of the photo. You can see a large dark patch of topsoil to the camera right.
Yes.
And that is what was left of the Spicer farm after being stripped of vegetation, covered with water for a season.
That's the 7/8 right there.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, and people for many years actually used to go down with buckets and steal what was left of the topsoil, just because it was the richest land near lake. So you can see the waterfront erosion barrier on the waterfront there above the wharf. That
yes.
sort of
that line.
Yeah, that line there, and that was put in place, a soil cement blanket, to protect the rising waters of the lake from inundating the village or eating away at the side of the village, because Nakusp is built on the delta of Kuskonax Creek, so it's lots of beach sand. So they actually paved the waterfront to prevent the lake from eating into the side of the village. When you go there today, we have a beautiful waterfront walkway, this nice seawall that people just think is lovely, but definitely paid a price to get it.
Yes, sure. and here's another image that shows high water, right?
Yeah, and you can see this is what it looks like at full pool, as they call it, full pond, and it, completely inundates what was left of the Spicer farm, just that island in the middle, which appears for half the year we have an island in the middle of Rockwell Bay. But yeah, it's beautiful, but underneath that water are a lot of lives and memories that are lost. So again, it's bittersweet for sure.
We're going to now go inside a home, and this photograph is one of my favorites in the book, and maybe it's because we're in the times of COVID, but this is someone getting a haircut, and it was taken by Ellis Anderson, I was reading, but
yes.
It's a spectacular image.
Yes, not every photo that we have in our collection is this orchestrated scenic piece or documenting a historic event. Whenever you see just a casual photo inside of someone's house, it's a rare thing. People don't tend to keep photos like that. Ellis Anderson was a postcard photographer from Creston. So his livelihood was made by taking photos of scenic locations around the Kootenays and selling them. But in all his travels, he made a lot of friends and a lot of acquaintances. And in this case, this is Ina and Fred Lade of Beaton. Fred Lade, who's a character in himself, a child of the Lardo mining country who left to go work in Vancouver and actually used to tell stories of the Old West and the frontier on CBC radio, and then retired back to Beaton in his old age. This is when you're and Beaton. If you've ever been there, it is a very remote location. You have to be very self-sufficient, because the nearest town is an hour away. So when you're self-sufficient, you learn how to do things like give your own haircuts.
Absolutely. It's suitable for framing. It's a wonderful image. We have one more before we wrap up. And I know we're just skimming the surface. There are so many more. But this is an optimistic picture, isn't it? Because this is the opening of the new village-owned hot springs.
Yes, this is October 19th, 1974, when Premier Dave Barrett himself came to open the Cuzco Hot Springs complex to the public. The previous hot springs developments in the area had all been private. These big ostentatious hotels on the waterfront lost to time, both from economic setbacks and then eventually from the flooding of the Arrow Lakes. But Cuzco Hot Springs, being located up in the mountains, has basically just been waiting for somebody to come along and develop it, even though it had been used by locals for decades. And it used to be a provincial park. It was a Class C provincial park, which meant it was still privately owned. And that family, the Leary family, actually willed the property to the village of Cuzco, to the people of Cuzco. And it took about a decade of planning for it to be finally developed into the, I wouldn't say resort, but certainly the more modern acquaintances that it has now.
And it's so refreshing.
Yes.
We jumped in a couple of years ago, and on a beautiful summer's day, there's nothing quite like it. And it's an important part of the economic underpinning of your community too, isn't it?
Absolutely. We have 5 hot springs, natural hot springs, within a half-hour drive of Cuzco. But this is what, and certainly there are numerous hot springs resorts throughout Cuzco. This is the only one that's municipally owned. And so whatever funds are generated from the pool and from the accommodation there, they come back into the community. And for a small village like Cuzco, that's a very important facet of our economy. Brings a lot of people who might not have otherwise discovered us out here in the mountains.
Kyle, this Community History Award is so well deserved. Thank you for taking us through a portion of your book. And just a final thought from you, going through this process of selecting images, and what did you learn about your community maybe you didn't know before?
I don't know if I learned anything new, but I had certain tenets reinforced, most notably just our sheer resiliency. We get ignored. I think a lot of people would say that, being out here, being a small town in the middle of nowhere, for better or for worse. But just the fact that you have to want to be here to make it work. And over the years, people have always found a way to make it work. And now Cuzco has, we're as strong as we've ever been, certainly in terms of tourism. And, maybe we're a bit more known to the outside world than we were a few decades ago. The other more solemn thing I learned while putting this book together is you may notice an absence of indigenous people in the book. And that's one of the other, people talk about the loss of the communities from flooding as a tragedy. The other great tragedy of the Arrow Lakes is the lack of recognition given to indigenous people in this valley. The Sinaiax people were essentially pushed into Washington about between 100 and 150 years ago, and were actually declared extinct within Canada by the federal government. And you basically have 4 or 5 generations of settlers within the valley who have had no contact with the indigenous heritage, no interface whatsoever with the indigenous heritage in this valley. And because there aren't any people to have that interface with.
There are pictographs and
Yeah.
that you do feature in the book as well. That's all that remains, I guess, in that
Yeah.
that sense. Kyle, thank you so much. Congratulations once again. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm very humbled by the award, and I'm very appreciative of the BC Historical Federation for bestowing this. And yeah, I had a lot of fun talking today.